Hi everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. I was preparing today to do a map update. However, once I kind of went through my list and checked what's happening with the map, I can only basically direct you to my previous video where I discuss in details what was the situation on the front lines. I will still cover it today, but I want to take it a little bit more conceptual approach and talk about what do we expect in a coming short-term perspective with the winter setting in. What would be the essentially the positions that Russians and Ukrainians want to get in. With that said, let's go. So around the Svatova-Kremina line, we know that Ukrainians essentially want to go this way, and Russians are counterattacking right away by using mobilized troops, and they're sending them to attack this way. That's pretty much the situation how it's been for a long time. I still don't agree with the deep state map, and none other mappers are showing that Novovodina and Makivka are under Russian control. I'm just hoping they're going to get fixed in the coming days. However, while Ukrainians are kind of pushing in, the Russians here are. It's actually something that I want to cover right away because I think that's important. So this is the part where we're talking, and then there's also around this part at the south, where it's the Vuhledar area where there was some big fighting happening just recently, and they needed to essentially push some Ukrainian troops out from this position so they can maybe have a little bit more secured supply route while the Crimean bridge is not really functioning that well. And the problem is that this costed Russians a lot. The attack, especially around Vuhledar, and counterattacks here around Makivka, are extremely costly for the Russian army. They have been using very little actual armor, and because of their artillery shortage, they cannot advance by using the artillery preparation that they did before, essentially making this fireball that just rolls forward and then Russians just follow along it. They don't have the capacity to do that. It's still bad, but so they just try to essentially advance with a mass of people, and a lot of these people were coming in with almost no armor support, and they were just people, people, people. Hence, we saw in the last couple of days, because of these two big areas where fighting was going on, that the casualties of Russian soldiers completely skyrocketed, completely went off the roof. But we now know that it didn't bring any kind of profit for the Russians. Ukrainians stood where they are, no major defense lines were pushed, and they costed Russians very, very dearly these attacks. It was a complete and utter disaster and failure. But if we're talking about the coming winter part, then we obviously need to understand the principle behind how to get winter. If you're staying out in the field inside of a trench, it is not as comfortable if you would be able to essentially have a position within a house with some kind of an infrastructure. Maybe half of it or even all of it doesn't work, but at least you have a proper roof over your head, and you can, maybe make it down to a basement where at least you're protected from most of the elements, which trenches not often they are fully protected. With that principle in mind, we obviously understand that Ukraine would love to get to Svatove. Ukraine would really love to get into the city and set up positions inside of the city going forward. I still expect Ukrainians to kind of go forward during the winter offensive, because right now it's the mud season, but it's slowly going forward. Like the mud season is ending. And once the cold set in, the ground becomes firm again, then Ukrainians can advance again. I think their logistics are supporting that advance. Especially, we're getting some reports that Ukrainians are amassing troops. I'm not going to show you where, but we know that they're amassing troops on some of the areas. So obviously, right now, Russians are in favorable position because they have Svatova, they have Kremina, but then they have like this part of the field, which is both a win potentially for Ukrainians, that this middle section is very loosely populated and they don't have enough buildings, so that's Russians staying in the fields. But also the downside is that it's quite predictable where Ukrainians will try to strike essentially. So it's both a double-edged sword. It's like it's a weakness, but it's a weakness that everyone knows about. So we'll see how Ukrainians will adapt and see. With regards to Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, I don't think anything will going to happen during the winter. But Ukrainians really want to hold Bilohorivka, and Russians really want to get Ukrainians out of Bilohorivka because Bilohorivka is a very good stationing point. But overall, there are places for Ukraine to kind of fall back, especially here around the Seversk line, Seversk Solidar line. This is basically, I'm drawing a lot of the circles. But yes, this is essentially the line that Ukrainians can fall back to if Bilohorivka gets taken. That would not be favorable because then you would need to retake and so on. The same kind of goes for Bakhmut. Bakhmut was really relevant, as we talked about many times, to then forward and advance towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk before Izium was lost. Now it doesn't have that big of a deal for advantage. However, it's a great city to have a hub for your forces. So Russians, they really want to get and take Bakhmut essentially before the colds get in. So then their troops have a nice proper hub where they can stay. Because if they don't, then they're gonna stay on the outskirts of Bakhmut, which is a lot of fields. And we've seen that basically it looks like a moon, like a World War One like overview with no trees, no life, nothing happening at all. It's gonna be a disaster to stay in those fields for the Russians over winter, and that would weaken their position and any kind of potential hold here. And many dead Russians will come along. Around the same kind of principle also is around Avdiivka, but to a lesser extent. This is because while Russians wants to take Avdiivka to get Ukrainians into the field, so the Ukrainians would have to essentially defend around the field areas around Avdiivka and not have that city. But the Russians, they don't really have that pressure because they have big cities, Donetsk and Makivka, that are nearby where they can host a lot of troops. So that's like for the Russians, it's not a problem. But for Ukrainians, holding Avdiivka is very important. Vuhledar and Pavlivka line, this is again something I mentioned already with regards to having fortified positions here for Ukrainians and the Russians wanting to protect their supply routes a little bit better. So Ukrainians will try to hold it, and it doesn't seem that Russians can take it because the attack that the Russians did here was extremely massive. Like I've seen pictures, like their reports, and I must say this cost Ukrainians a lot of lives. Like the casualties reported for Ukrainians around the Vuhledar area were quite big. Obviously, knowing also that Russian casualties were completely through the roofs. But this was definitely a very bloody fight, a bloody moment, and this is one of those moments that gets my blood boiling when I see some kind of news review and they're saying, well, nothing is happening in Ukraine. Why is that? You know, like they're looking at the map. Oh, the map didn't move, therefore nothing's happening. Because what is happening here around Vuhledar, it's a complete bloodbath for both sides. So it's hard to say that nothing is happening. We definitely hear news around Kherson, but as we discussed before, I am being very cautious around what's going to happen. But the Ukrainians will need to essentially advance here. Like there is a lot of fields here, and someone was saying that Russians are using a lot of natural barriers here to their advantage, and that does make sense. But this is going to be hard for both sides because Kherson, north part of this Kherson area, is pretty much fields both ways until you reach to the big cities. There is no major settlements here. Therefore, it's going to be very problematic for both sides to fight in the city. That's why I think Russians want to fortify essentially the key areas, which is around Berislav. Oh, sorry. I'm just going to take the red one. The area around Berislav, the area around Novakhovka, the area around Kherson, and potentially around this road as well. So those are kind of the key areas for Russians to fortify. And then essentially they will stay in more urbanized places within Kherson, but Ukrainians will stay more towards the fields. But we'll see what the Ukrainian plan is. I am very hopeful and optimistic because we're getting a lot of new reports, and I'm actually going to switch to my vlog camera because we went through the front line. But the reports are that now that UK is donating a couple of hundred thousands of winter uniforms. And generally speaking, Ukraine is getting supplies needed for their winter offensive. And continue with some other news. We need to understand that one of the major things happened just recently, and I am not a big fan of Olaf Scholz. Like, well, okay, let's put it this way. I think he was too indecisive for a while, and I was not completely agreeing with politics. I do not dismiss him as a politician, like, for example, I dismiss dictators like Putin or Erdogan. But Scholz definitely brought something, and I was actually quite surprised that it went under the radar completely. He was essentially negotiating with Xi Jinping, and after their meeting, China came out with a statement that essentially nuclear weapons used by Russia would be crossing the red line. This is massive. Like, I don't know, understand why it didn't was underscored even more. The fact that China is stating that nuclear weapons is a no-go in this conflict for Russia is a big deal, because Russian can always kind of, like, we can nuke Ukraine, whatever West's puts us, like, however the pressures. Let's not go down that rhetoric. We discussed it many times. But China was always kind of like, the default fallback partner for the Russians. That yes, if everything else fails, we still at least have the partnership here in the Asia. The Chinese saying that no, nuclear is like too much, is basically a death sentence for Putin if he decides to use nuclear weapons, which essentially means that we will not see nuclear weapons in this conflict, period. Obviously, there is like 1% chance that something might happen. Let's leave that. But any kind of worries that we had about nuclear weapons is pretty much, they didn't have. They completely reduced to negligible possibilities. So we finally can breathe out and say, yes, there will not be nuclear weapons used in this conflict. And that was massive. And I need to give credit to where credit is due, which is the credit given to Olaf Scholz. Never thought I would say this, but there you go. So thank you so much, Mr. Scholz, for at least removing that thread of the table. Thanks for watching, liking, subscribing. Oh, remember, some people have reported they don't get notifications about my videos. Guys, you need to ring a bell to get notifications on YouTube. They did it like a couple of years ago, I think. So if you want to get notifications, you need to press the bell button somewhere. I don't know. But whatever. Just drop in some more times. Big thanks to all of the Patreon supporters. I love you all. I'm really happy that I'm able to do and support Ukraine with you watching, liking, subscribing, sharing this video on your social media. Always amazing. See you next time.